Welcome to Arirang News Special. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. Over in New Delhi, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol presented ways for South Korea to fulfill its responsible diplomacy as he put his vision for global freedom, peace, and prosperity into action. This included more funding for Ukraine and a set of universal principles on digital technology on the final day of the G20 Summit. Or Oh Soo-young reports as she travels back to Seoul with the president.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has pledged $2.3 billion to support recovery efforts in Ukraine and renewed his call for universal norms on digital technology, presenting ways to secure a prosperous future for the world. Speaking at the G20 Summit on Sunday, Yoon said Seoul will announce a $300 million package for Ukraine in 2024 and a $2 billion mid to long-term support plan consisting of long-term low-interest loans in 2025. The initial $300 million package will cover development cooperation and humanitarian aid, which would include the participation of international organizations such as the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This comes after President Yoon in July had a surprise meeting in Kyiv with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky and pledged to roll out official development assistance to help rebuild the war-torn nation.
This demonstrates Seoul's responsible role in leading the way to support the restoration of peace as a global pivotal state that contributes to freedom, peace, and prosperity in the world, while also laying the foundation for full-scale participation in Ukraine's reconstruction in the future.
Further elaborating on South Korea's role and contribution to a free and rules-based international order, President Yoon also emphasized the need to strengthen the role of multilateral development banks. In order to respond to new challenges such as overcoming the climate crisis and strengthening food and energy security, Yoon said it is vital to expand available financial resources and debt restructuring programs for low-income countries. Yoon pledged efforts to lead such discussions as Seoul serves as a co-chair along with France in the G20's International Financial Architecture Working Group. Addressing the fast-evolving advancement of digital technology, President Yoon renewed his push to establish new universal norms and established an international organization that addresses the misuse of technology and the widening digital gap between societies. A presidential official said Seoul will soon prepare and announce a digital bill of rights that ensures all people in all societies can enjoy the right to digital technology and push for measures to address the benefits and side effects of AI and digital tech, as well as the need for a consensus on ethical and moral norms. The South Korean leader in June proposed a set of basic principles on the ethical and sustainable use of technology.
President Yoon, stressing the importance and necessity of digital norms, has been recognized by the international community, as shown by the G20 Summit communiqué, which reflects Seoul's plan for cooperation in establishing international AI governance.
Presenting measures to pursue freedom, peace and prosperity in the world amid complex challenges and bridging gaps between the global north and south. The top office says President Yoon aims to solidify Korea's status as a responsible actor in the international community as a global pivotal state. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, New Delhi.
And President Yoon and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi are set to discuss bilateral trade and ways to strengthen cooperation in space, IT, and other strategic areas. Falling upon the 50th anniversary of Korea-India diplomatic relations, the meeting will take place on Sunday in New Delhi before the South Korean leader returns to Seoul after attending the G20 Summit in the Indian capital. Speaking to a local paper ahead of his visit, Yoon said that when he meets with Modi, they will look to strengthen trade and economic relations through talks on the two countries' 2010 Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, as well as enhancing cooperation in the defense industry and high-tech supply chains. Yoon and Modi will also look to enhance infrastructure cooperation through Seoul's Economic Development Cooperation Fund and ramp up joint research and collaboration in space, nuclear energy, biohealth, and other key technologies. President Yoon is utilizing multilateral summitry to ensure he meets as many leaders as possible. While discussions may vary with specific topics catered to each country, one thing he says to leaders is being repeated. The request to support Busan's bid to host World Expo in 2030, the vote on which will come in just 2 months. Our Kim Do-yeon has the details.
President Yoon Suk-yeol is using the G20 Summit in New Delhi as a stage to have sideline meetings with as many other leaders as possible in order to enhance mutual cooperation and promote Busan's bid to host the World Expo 2030. Just on Saturday, the first official day of the summit, he talked with 10 heads of state. Notably, President Yoon met with the leaders of MICTA, a group comprised of Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia. The leaders celebrated the 10th anniversary of MICTA's foundation and said that they share deep concerns on the challenging global strategic environment due to increasing divisions in the world and problematic issues such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and climate change. Together, they pledged to abide by international law and order and enhance cooperation to tackle these challenges. In addition, Yoon met with his Argentinian counterpart, Alberto Fernandez, and discussed ways to strengthen bilateral ties on the back of 60 years since the establishment of official diplomatic ties. The two focused on supply chain reformation and exchanges for battery production. Argentina is one of the richest countries with regard to resources such as lithium, and so South Korea's battery production technology could see the two nations benefiting from each other. According to the presidential office, Yoon also requested Fernandez's support for Busan's World Expo bid. In fact, the office said the president requested support from all the leaders he met on top of discussing bilateral cooperation. What is notable is that of the 10 leaders Yoon met on Saturday, 3 were from Africa, namely Comoros, Nigeria, and Mauritius. The president asked for their support as well because Africa is likely to play a crucial role in the upcoming vote in November, as the continent has the second largest contingent in the Bureau International des Expositions, the Expo organizing body with around 50 members. On Sunday, Yoon will meet with the leaders of Italy and India to wrap up his diplomatic super week. By the end of this overseas trip, including the early ASEAN summit, the presidential office said Yoon will have met with at least 20 leaders from around the world. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The G20 Summit provided an opportunity for President Yoon Suk-yeol and his U.S. counterpart, Joe Biden, to reconnect just a few weeks after the Camp David trilateral summit, with the two reaffirming even closer ties. On Saturday local time, the two met a total of 3 times, one of them being when they sat next to each other during the gala dinner, with an opportunity to discuss candidly about ongoing issues for an hour and a half. And according to the top office, earlier in the day, the two came across each other at the venue for bilateral summits. There, Biden joked that Yoon should come home with him since the two spent time together at his vacation spot. Yoon, in reply, said it was an unforgettable moment and a historic one. The two also met at the Leaders' Lounge for the first time at the G20, where Yoon was spotted telling Biden that he was reiterating Seoul, Washington, Tokyo ties for a prosperous world. Despite different views over the war in Ukraine, the group of 20 economies managed to reach a consensus, but stopped short of condemning Russia. Ukraine reacted. The joint declaration was nothing to be proud of amid world leaders showing mixed reactions. Bae Eun-ji has more.
The Group of 20 has adopted a declaration that backed Ukraine by calling on all states not to use force to grab territory, but it avoided directly condemning Russia for the war. During the gathering in New Delhi, the Indian Prime Minister said on Saturday local time that countries had reached a consensus on a declaration on the first day of their 2-day meeting.
I recently received the good news that on the back of the hard work of all the teams, we have received consensus on the G20 Leaders Summit declaration.
The consensus was reached earlier than expected, as G20 is deeply divided over the war in Ukraine. Western nations have been pushing for strong condemnation of Russia in the declaration, while others demand a focus on broader economic issues. This year, the statement did not include phrases as strong as those used in Bali last year, when the members deplored in the strongest terms the aggression by Russia against Ukraine, although it noted that there were other views and different assessments of the situation. In response, Ukraine's foreign ministry said the declaration was, quote, nothing to be proud of, and criticized it for not mentioning Russia. The country's foreign ministry spokesperson wrote on social media that a Ukrainian presence would have given participants a better understanding of the situation. But despite disappointment, he thanked Ukraine's allies for doing their part to advance Ukraine's position in the declaration. The leaders of Britain and Germany, however, assessed that the joint statement from the summit was a success. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called the declaration a good and strong outcome that had very strong language about Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also said the statement demonstrated a clear position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying the territorial integrity of countries cannot be called into question with violence. 배은지, Arirang News.
It's been a busy week for world leaders as a host of high-stakes meetings took place in Indonesia and India, involving Southeast Asian nations and other key regional players. South Korean President Yoon was no exception. For a wrap-up of his packed diplomatic schedule and what it means for Korea's diplomacy, I'm joined by Principal Researcher Kim Jong-un from the East Asia Institute. Dr. Kim, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Overall, how do you assess what was discussed at this year's Group of 20 Economies meeting?
I think I have to say it was a pretty successful one, and India did an excellent job in organizing this event, I guess, and especially because of, as you just mentioned, like the successful adoption of the leaders' declaration. A lot of people worry about this summit, particularly because of the absence of President Xi Jinping and President Biden at the same time. And
also, not President Biden.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, President Putin,
yes.
Sorry, President Putin and President Xi Jinping. And a lot of concerns over that this because of this clear cleavage between the Western countries and the authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, and would be able to produce any productive outcomes, especially because we had never had any single communique during the ministerial meetings during the India's G20 presidency this year so far. So this is pretty amazing, I think. And I think this is because of this result of 200 hours of ruthless negotiations, of course. And I think that deserves some recognition. And not only they managed to have this statement, but also they covered a lot of important issues like climate financing, global debt, and reforms of institutions like the World Bank. And also the African Union is officially joined G20, invited by India. So I think Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi should be proud of it, and also it's going to help him a little bit in next election. But also it's going to be a pleasant news for Washington as well, because as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan repeatedly mentioned before his travel to New Delhi, that, here I quote, the U.S. has a deep stake in stewarding the G20 and ensuring that it remains a central mechanism for global coordination on all the major challenges we face. And Washington committed to host the G20 in 2026. So the success of the G20 this year is going to be a good news for Washington as well.
Mm-hmm. And addressing the G20 leaders, South Korean President Yoon vowed to expand Korea's contributions to the climate, Green Climate Fund and Ukraine. Where does that leave Korea on the global stage?
Yeah, right. The Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-hyo mentioned that during the press briefing on September 9th, the G20 Summit will be a showcase for South Korea to extend its role beyond even Indo-Pacific to address global agenda. And the Senior Presidential Secretary for Economic Affairs, Choi Sang-mok, also emphasized that Korea did not have to contribute this money because it already made a contribution twice, $100 million in 2013 and $200 million during the 2020 to 2023 fundraising period. So this additional $300 million to Green Climate Fund, the GCF, is going to be well received by other countries. And in addition, Yoon also pledged to support developing countries to their green transition through knowledge sharing, and also Korea is going to play the role of green ladder to assist nations vulnerable to climate change. And also, he presented a vision of green shipping corridor, which is going to use development of the low carbon or carbon-free vessels, as well as the environmentally friendly port infrastructure. And consider this, sustainable growth is everybody's problem. And South Korea's commitment to this global issue is going to elevate South Korea's status in the global politics for sure, especially like, for example, China always tried to link their commitment to this global climate change issues with their national interests, such as, like, for example, like U.S.-China climate change cooperation can only be possible when there is a healthy development of relations between the U.S. and China, and that's prevented because U.S. is now holding the strategy or policy of small yard and high fence, is trying to prevent China's investment in semiconductor and artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So even China is trying to connect the national interest with this global issue. And South Korea is actually playing a leadership role in here, which is going to be very helpful for South Korea's future foreign policy.
All right. And Dr. Kim, President Yoon holds an array of bilateral talks with middle and emerging powers, including India and MICTA. So in what way do they carry significance for this nation?
I remember the presidential office mentioned the MICTA meeting along with other G20 Summit that President Yoon is going to have for the Busan's bid for the 2030 World Expo. And of course, the Expo is an important issue. But I think a lot more is at stake in coordination with these MICTA countries, because I think it's inevitable for South Korea to strengthen the relationship cooperation with the United States and also the Global Alliance Network U.S. is now formulating. It's essential. We have to join them. But at the same time, we have to send the message that South Korea is not supporting everything that Washington does. What we are trying to do is trying to establish a global governance based on principle that agreed by all countries, like based on universal value, for instance. So we could always talk about the freedom of choice, like respect for everybody's core interests, respect for international institutions like UN, or freedom of navigation and so on, to show that this is about a principle, not about ideology. So South Korea has to demonstrate that it's a two-pillar of foreign policy. We have a strengthened cooperation with the U.S. as important ally, but also we are going to have this idea that we are going to establish a global norms and that could even binding United States. And MICTA is very important, the group of countries that we can cooperate with in establishing this rules-based order.
And Doctor, let's now talk about the ASEAN-related summits. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is likely to travel to Russia to meet President Putin and discuss arms deal. President Yoon at the ASEAN summit warned against any attempt to add military cooperation with the regime. And so what do you read into a message? And before I let you go, some say President Yoon maintained critical tone on Russia for this alleged arms cooperation, while at the same time, he adopted a softer tone towards China, hoping for cooperation on North Korea as President Yoon met Chinese Premier Li Qiang. What's your view?
Well, a lot to cover. Okay. So first, I have to say that this is happening because nobody was prepared for this largest conventional war since the World War II, and everybody engaged in this war is experiencing the shortage of ammunition. Even if you have weapons, you cannot sustain war if you don't have ammunition, right? And the only part of the world that has a large stockpile of ammunition is Korean Peninsula, because we are still under armistice, and both South and North Korea has substantial reserves. And that's why Russia needs support from North Korea. But what's interesting thing is that as Sullivan, National Security Advisor Sullivan mentioned, that even though the cooperation between the two countries are fastly advancing, North Korea has yet provided substantial amount of munitions or military support to Moscow. So that means that we still have opportunity to stop that. That's why we have to send a strong message warning against it. That's why I think President Yoon mentioned it. And also, like, the reason why the South Korea has to have some carefully chosen path towards China is because China is reacting strangely these days, because I see that there is a shift in tone in the bilateral relations. Like, since when there is a criticism from Ambassador Shin Hai-ming, it upset a lot of members, the government officials in the Yoon government, and a lot of people speculated that after this Camp David trilateral meeting, Beijing is going to criticize Seoul heavily. But very interestingly, Beijing did not attack South Korea directly, and there was even a constructive dialogue between Foreign Minister Park Jin and his counterpart Wang Yi over telephone last week, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, here I quote, that China has very clear intention to develop the relationship between the two countries, and it's kind of natural. And Park Jin also replied that it is impossible and infeasible for us to cutting China off from the supply chain. So we see that China is kind of playing some kind of pulling and pushing game, like miltang in Korea. So like China is now engaging South Korea heavily, and we saw that Lee Chang and meeting between Premier Lee Chang and the President Yoon Suk-yeol again, and they talk about a lot of issues, and again they cover a lot of extensive issues that both countries can cooperate with each other, like free trade, supply chain, and cooperation in the cutting edge technologies. So as Beijing is engaging with Seoul now, I think we have to pull China this time for some time, and let's see how it goes from here.
Interesting. All right, Dr. Kim, we appreciate your insights.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. And now joining me is Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone, live from New Delhi, who has been following the G20 Summit on the ground. Jessica, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to ask you, the group of G20, the group of 20 economies now have a communique. So how did they reach it so quickly, and what's the reaction in the U.S.?
Well, it did come about very quickly. In fact, by 3 p.m. on the day one of the G20, they were already briefing us about a communique that had been agreed to, not signed, but agreed to by all the parties. And really the main way they got there is by India's leadership in getting the Global South to agree to put forth some language that was palatable to the United States and Europe in particular over the issue of Ukraine. Bloomberg is reporting that India, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa, so 3 BRICS countries there, came up with the language, and certainly Washington took softer language. This is quite a bit softer than the Bali Declaration in terms of the position on Ukraine. It's no longer a war against Ukraine, it's a war in Ukraine in terms of the language, which obviously has some gray area left in there for who caused the war. There's no mention directly of Russia, as you probably have noticed. But what was really amazing here is that with the absence of China and Russia at these meetings, in terms of their presidents in any case, you really saw India step into that void and bring consensus when there was real doubt about whether there would be a communique. Remember how close it was in Bali? It could have been that close this time.
And as you mentioned, President Joe Biden was present at the G20 Summit along with its U.S. allies and partners, but the presidents of China and Russia were absent. So is Mr. Biden gaining leverage from this? Also, what can you tell us about the U.S.-led multinational rail and ports plan linking India to the Middle East and Europe?
Yeah, out of that void that China left, you really saw the U.S. Also step into that with this infrastructure announcement in conjunction with India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, and Europe. This is going to be a very ambitious project. We have very few details on how long it's going to take, on how much it's going to cost, on who's going to pay for it. but it would be a rail and sail link, essentially, between Europe through the Middle East to India. Some of this is existing infrastructure that will be repurposed. Some of it has to be new infrastructure that will be built. But for the United States, they are making the point that this is a non-coercive, transparent means of funding these large infrastructure projects. Who does that sound like? Maybe China's Belt and Road.
And Jessica, and what does an apparent rift in the G20 mean at a time when Russia and China are seemingly forging closer ties with BRICS?
I think it's very clear that India showed that those rifts can be overcome, that they can make the point about what's going on in Ukraine and about the aggression occurring there, its impact on the global economy and the global food supply, without the type of language that was used in Bali. And that allowed it to be signed off on by Russia and by China. And it sort of shows that the G20 is still a relevant body that can be used to counter the likes of aggressive behavior by any one of its members.
And before you go, Jessica, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is apparently planning a trip to Russia sooner rather than later to meet President Putin for talks on weapons. How are world leaders responding to this, including President Biden?
Well, there hasn't been a statement by President Biden about this. We understand that Kim Jong-un is going to go to Vladivostok to attend that Eastern Economic Forum that Russia is holding, and that is the most likely location where he would meet on the sidelines with President Putin. Vice President Harris, however, has addressed this possibility. She said, quote, "Such a meeting would be a huge mistake." National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also addressing it, saying North Korea will pay a huge price in the international community, so inferring that not just potentially American sanctions could be doubled down upon, but that the international community will frown highly on this. And the White House also believes that Russia's seeming need to even entertain a conversation with North Korea in order to obtain more weapons for Ukraine is a sign that the sanctions are biting deep and motivating this kind of contact between these two countries.
All right, VOA correspondent Jessica Stone, thanks for your coverage.
You bet. Good to see you.
Russian government officials have reportedly said that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will arrive in Vladivostok on Monday, a day before President Vladimir Putin. Kim is expected to travel to Russia in his armored train, meaning he could possibly be making the same 20-hour journey he took when he met Putin 4 years ago. If all goes as planned, Kim and Putin will likely meet on Tuesday at the Far Eastern Federal University on an island off central Vladivostok, where the Eastern Economic Forum will take place. This comes after the New York Times reported last Monday that Kim's meeting with Putin is most likely to discuss arms sales. The questioning of South Korea's main opposition Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung at Suwon District Prosecutor's Office over allegations he participated in illegally sending money to North Korea had to be cut short on Saturday. This was due to concerns over Lee's health, as he has been on a hunger strike that has stretched it into its 10th day. He was being questioned about Sangbangul Group, an underwear manufacturer that allegedly transferred $8 million to North Korea illegally between January 2019 and January 2020 at the request of Lee Hwa-young, the former vice governor of Gyeonggi-do province. DP leader Lee was the governor of the province at the time, and the prosecution views the company's action as third-party bribery. Prosecutors were questioning the DP leader about his knowledge of the matter and whether he was involved, as has been alleged. They have requested that the questioning be resumed on the 12th, but Lee has as yet been non-committal regarding this. The earthquake that struck Morocco on Friday night has left more than 2,000 people dead and another 2,000 injured. However, the toll is expected to rise as rescuers struggle to reach hard-hit remote areas in their search for survivors. The 6.8 magnitude quake that hit the central part of the country at around 11 p.m. local time was the largest in 120 years and caused widespread damage in and around the city of Marrakesh, a popular tourist destination. The Moroccan government announced 3 days of national mourning. The South Korean embassy in Morocco said it has received no reports of any Korean nationals affected by the earthquake. And that wraps up Arirang News Special. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of the weekend.